Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE, GMAT, and graduate school admissions. I'm Tyler, founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your exam. A full textbook, videos on key topics, tons of GRE questions backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, a built in study planner and essay grader, and full length practice exams. You can try it out for free by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, the code podcast gets you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today we've got Karthik Rajeswaran with us from MBALink. Let's have you introduce yourself.
Cool. Thanks, Tyler. Happy to be back on Jerry Snacks. So yeah, I'm Karthik from MBALink. We are an MBA admissions consultancy based in Singapore, predominantly focusing on helping people from Asia get into the top MBA programs around the world. Of course, we do work with clients from everywhere, but I'd say a predominant focus for people from Asia.
Great. Yeah, and that makes you probably the perfect person to talk
Hmm.
today about this topic, right? Which is if you're an international student, particularly from Asia, applying to US MBA programs in
Yeah.
2026, there is a lot of uncertainty right now. And I think let's talk about first like the macro situation,
Yes.
essentially like why is there uncertainty, just in case people maybe aren't sure or just kind of want to make sure they have the full scope of things. But then how has that affected how MBA applications were this year, and what
Yeah.
does that look like for next year?
Sure. Look, if you haven't been living under a rock or in the middle of the jungle, you know that there was a major regime change earlier this year in the US, that is. And of course, the US being the main hub of MBA programs and honestly postgraduate degrees around the world, that has caused a lot of, again, chaos is the right word, and uncertainty when it comes to knowing what to expect with both graduate school applications. First and foremost, whether visas are even going to be granted. There was a lot of scrutiny on Harvard, Columbia, and many other very well known and reputed schools when it comes to their ability to be able to hand out student visas. There were threats around existing student visas being cancelled based on certain criteria. And then I think the even bigger macro challenge and question is around once you graduate, what happens?
Hmm.
Of course, generally around the world, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the job market, but specifically in the US, which is again the most in demand market, there's a lot of changes and uncertainty when it comes to the visa process, whether it's your H-1B visa or anything else. People really don't know what to expect. And so I think that's a good starting point for us to get into the specifics of why there is so much uncertainty.
Yeah, and I mean, how do you want to approach this topic, I guess? Like, do you want to just
Mm.
like jump right in on everything with the visa situation first?
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point. So at the end of the day, um, see, what you can't control, unless you're very politically connected, what you can't control is what decisions get made. But what you can control as a potential applicant or student, obviously, is being aware of the changes that are happening and being a bit more strategic about how you think about your application process. So, at the end of the day, with visas, I think this has been a perennial challenge for international students wherever in the world you go. If you're going to go and study in a country that is not your home country, you're always at the mercy of a company being able to sponsor your visa. And then, of course, the government policies making it easy for your visa to be approved. And then, of course, how long you also get that visa for, right? Is it just going to be 1 year? Are you going to get it for 5 years, 10 years? Is there a path to permanent residency, citizenship? These are all considerations for a lot of students. And I think in our experience over the years, what we've realized is that for a lot of students, postgraduate programs and especially MBAs are viewed as a way for them to migrate or spend time in whichever country they want to go and study in. I think very common examples again with the US is a lot of people going and studying in the US and then wanting to live and work in the US, whether they want to get into finance on Wall Street, whether they want to get into tech in San Francisco. Those have been very common paths that people take. In Europe, it tends to be people go to INSEAD or LBS and then they end up working in London, Paris, of course, increasingly Dubai, Singapore as well. So at the end of the day, your study visa is one aspect of it. Usually people get that without much of an issue. But the bigger issue is what's going to happen in the job market and the visas that they can get afterwards. And of
And I mean,
course,
I
I
think that
think,
is one of the biggest
sorry.
draws, right, of going to these like foreign business schools is it's usually one of the easiest ways to get a job in that country afterwards.
Absolutely. And historically, it's been a very a clear pathway, because a top tier MBA program is a strong signal to potential employers. People who've gone into top MBA programs generally tend to meet all of the criteria when it comes to education levels, salary levels, so on and so forth. But even that is no longer sort of a guarantee that your visa is going to get approved or granted. And yes, you're spot on. That has been a big attraction, and that's really causing people to think twice about applying to, first and foremost, the US, and I think some of the other markets as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. On, do you feel like the visa situation is going to potentially change? Like it does, I haven't seen it get worse for a while. Do we think that things are going to turn around? I mean, at the end of the day, I do think businesses really want this, like this highly skilled population to be still coming into the country, right? So,
Yeah. Look, honestly, I think the way the world is going at the moment is that public policy gets decided on Twitter posts or X posts and certain other social media channels. So some of this is really hard to predict. I think what's clear is the intention from the government, if you can put it in that way. However, whether they can actually push a lot of these policies through is what I think is causing things to take a bit longer, which is good in the grand scheme. I think some of the policies that have been put in place, even if they might be coming from the right place of wanting to protect local jobs or ensure there are more opportunities for citizens, the way in which and the extreme end to which they were being taken was not going to be beneficial in the long run. So some of these policies may be deemed unconstitutional, which I think some of them have been. And so that's why there's also so much uncertainty. It's not clear exactly what is going to pass and when. And even with some of the MBA programs, I think, again, for the last 2 years, many of them have fallen under the STEM bucket, which has allowed people to get the OTP visa in the US and work on for a few more years. It's
mhm,
currently unclear which MBA programs are still going to fall under that bucket and which ones will not. So it's some of that is you're playing by ear and having to check very specifically, hey, for this school, is our visa still being granted? Will it still qualify as a STEM degree, etc.? But yeah, fortunately, it doesn't seem to have been as bad as the initial sort of fears, but you
mhm.
still have to do a lot more research to make sure that you're in the clear.
Yeah. And so all of this uncertainty is, leading a lot of people to just kind of not apply, right? I mean,
Mm,
which in a weird way is kind of an advantage if you are still sticking it out and applying. Because
you're
MBA
spot on.
programs, they really want, this top talent from around the world. And also, um, I think that they love the fact that generally most of those people pay full price, right? Or pretty close. So, I mean, it is almost like an opportunity in a weird way for the people that are still applying. But I mean, do you agree with that idea, or that's just kind of
Yes.
what I'm thinking as I think about this?
No, you're spot on, Tyler. And I think that's the almost we're seeing this in many other aspects, what they're calling the K-shaped economy, where people who are doing well are continuing to do really well, and people who are maybe struggling or not doing so well, things are getting harder. It's very similar with the MBA applications for international students. So, as we touched on earlier, many people have been applying, let's say to the US, for example, saying it's for me, it's the US or bust. Okay. And we initially thought when we'd speak to some of these clients, okay, look, be open-minded, consider programs in Europe or Asia and so on. But it's very clear that for many candidates, they only want to do an MBA if it's going to allow them to get into the US. And for people where that's not an option or they don't feel confident about their chances, they're skipping applying to MBA programs entirely. And so when you feel that strongly about it, then that's your prerogative. However, as you
Mhm.
rightly point out, for those who are actually sticking it through and applying, your competitive pool is a bit different and honestly a bit less competitive in this current cycle. But when we say less competitive, though, to be clear, maybe it's a slightly lower volume of people applying from international backgrounds. However, at the top end, the competition is still very high. So I don't necessarily think it's any easier. It's just that you may be competing with fewer people for some of the schools that you're applying to. And as you also correctly touched on, top MBA schools love international students. Of course, people being able to pay is one thing, or being willing to pay is one thing. But of course, it just brings diversity to the classroom, right? At the end of the
Right.
day, business is global. I think we've long passed things being just very hyper localized. Business is global. And having those international perspectives in a classroom and people being able to learn from others is invaluable. But the mix in the classroom, the ability to give out scholarships and so on is a challenge. And it's also significantly more expensive for international students as well, because a lot of the time of their weaker local currencies, lower earnings, and so on. So the bigger challenge, I would argue, is that international students have historically relied a lot on getting scholarships to some extent, or maybe loans, and it may be tougher to come by at the moment. So from a financing perspective, international students do have to think about that a whole lot more. We are seeing small pockets of international students, just to touch on this point, who, for example, were initially focused on the US but realized that their chances were not so good, or maybe they applied and didn't get in round one, who are now becoming more open minded to applying to international programs. So, again, the likes of INSEAD, LBS, ESA, some of the schools in Asia like NUS and SMU. And so that is evolving. We're seeing that happen, just like that shift from round one to round two is happening right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you think is driving that shift? Is it just sort of the US is no longer the be all end all? Is it, yeah, like what do you think it is?
I think that is a big factor, yes. As you rightly say, for a very long time, the US was seen as the be all end all. It's the biggest market in the world, the one where, it drives most of the economic activity around the world, not just locally. If you are a young, ambitious person, you want to end up in the US in some way, shape, or form, or in many cases, working for a US company in another location, right? But the US drove a lot of economic activity and still does. That being said, given how much more difficult it has become, people are having to be more open-minded about one, working in countries where they have visa or work authorization, as they call it. So a lot of the times people have to go back to their home countries to find jobs, or to other countries where it's easier to get a work visa. So that's one thing. The other is simply job opportunities. So if you are finding that in the US at the moment it's very tough to find work or get a visa, you have to consider which other regions are, let's say, booming and growing, and where opportunity lies. And of course, there are always pockets of opportunity in Europe, in Asia, but the region that is probably seeing the most growth and is a lot more open with hiring is the Middle East. So a lot of top MBA graduates, even if they go study in Europe or Asia or sometimes even in the US, are finding jobs in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Saudi as well. So that's just something for people to be mindful of.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I think it's also there's quite a lot of just like uncertainty and like people really like some sort of certainty, right? Yeah. Well, yeah, I think let's also talk about, you know, let's say you do want to become one of these people that goes against the grain and applies to a US MBA anyway, because maybe it's a good season
Yeah.
to do so. What advice do you have for those people, right? What do they have to take special care to think about this year?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Tyler. So I think in the past, you could almost blindly say, hey, look, I want to get into consulting, I want to get into investment banking, I want to get a product manager job in tech. Firstly, almost everybody wants to do that, so it's hyper competitive. But even more realistically, I think candidates have to show even more how unique or differentiated they are and their application is. That's one. But following up on that, you need to show that you are aware of just how tough the job market is, and how you are going to be able to find a job with or without the help of the school or like the hiring teams that come to campuses and stuff like that. Showing that you are more entrepreneurial, you are more open minded, you are willing to figure out how to get a job or maybe even start your own business, right? So I think showing that you want to be an entrepreneur or start a business is actually a key point that I would mention to somebody, unless they're very clear that they don't want to get into entrepreneurship. Showing that you are willing to figure something out, even if the job market is not in your favor, is a very key point. The other
Hmm.
thing is that, especially for international candidates, you need to be able to show that you're open minded about your geography. So if you write in your story that I only want to work in New York, in private equity, in banking or consulting, I think that's going to work really against you. Whereas in the past, it may have been in your favor, because it's just so competitive and honestly not realistic to think that you're definitely going to get one of those jobs. So if you're able to explain that, look, my first choice or preference would be to end up in the US in these industries, but I'm open minded to going back to my own country or even going somewhere else and trying something different, shows that you have a level of flexibility. Because at the end of the day, for top MBA programs, people being placed into high earning jobs is a key outcome for them. Not entirely across the board. If you're a successful business person, entrepreneur, or you go into a family business even, those are all good outcomes. But they want to see that you are pragmatic and open minded about what you're doing. and what you want to do next.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that all makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, like, is the r- sort of suggestion that people show more flexibility? Because I
Mm.
think one of the big things that you're always told to do is like demonstrate interest, right? And so if you're
Yeah.
applying to NYU Stern and you're like, I want to work in New York and go to private equity, that was a sound
Hmm.
strategy for a long time.
Yes.
So, like, why does the school want to see that you can be flexible? Is it because they want to know that you're still going to have a job if you don't get a visa? Because I feel like they could assume that. I mean, if you're graduating from NYU Stern, I don't know. I'm just curious. Like, yeah.
No, but it's exactly that point, right? I think a few years ago, you could safely assume that someone is going to get their work visa approved, get a role in a certain type of company and industry and so on. Now, you really can't. Unless you're one of the unicorn candidates and maybe in the top 5%, then it's a different story. But other than that, you really cannot say with certainty that someone is going to get all of the things that you thought they would in the past. And so, being open minded at the very least, like if you're clear, for example, I want to end up in private equity. Geographically, you can't say with certainty that you will be in a certain city, let alone in the US. So, if private equity in Europe doesn't work out, where else could you go? Where are the other hubs around the world? You could go to London, you could go to Singapore, you could go to Dubai, you could go to Hong Kong, you could go to a bunch of other places, honestly speaking. So, are you open minded to that? Are you willing to do that? Of course, certain people have personal constraints and may not be able to be that flexible. But showing that you're willing to consider that and try something different is a good indication in the grand scheme. Of course, that doesn't mean you should spray and pray. So let's be very clear on that, right? It shouldn't be a case of, hey, look, I'll just take any job that comes my way, any industry, any location. No, that's not what we're advocating. But it's more so be clear in what you want to do, but have a level of flexibility within that realm.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, any other advice that you have for people that are looking to do this, to apply to US MBAs this year?
Mm. I think See, the schools are also, to their credit, trying to adapt as quickly as they possibly can to both sort of policy changes as well as the changing dynamics of the job and work environment. And I think that's really the biggest uncertainty. I think another key skill or skill set to showcase is your AI fluency and your AI nativeness or nativity. I guess maybe that's the right word to share. If you're lazy and you're just using AI to write your essays for you or something like that, it will show very clearly, and that's not a good look. But if you can showcase in, I'd say two key things. One, how are you already using AI and how will you be able to use it in future to basically supercharge your abilities and outcomes and output? Secondly, it's almost like the more dystopian view of how can you very clearly showcase that you can do a job that AI cannot do, or you are
Hmm.
going to bring value that AI cannot bring. Because historically, okay, pre MBA, a lot of people would have done, let's say, entry level analyst type of roles. A lot of them, unfortunately, don't exist anymore or are being scrutinized a whole lot more. Now, maybe post MBA, you're going to do a slightly more revenue generating, relationship driven role where you're bringing in business or leading a team, managing people. And those are the skills that really have to shine. And I think the challenge historically for international students has been an over reliance on, for lack of a better word, grunt work,
Hmm.
especially early on in your career, and an over reliance on showcasing, hey, look, my test scores are so amazing, I'm so smart. But raw horsepower and IQ is no longer sufficient. You need a lot of EQ, you need a lot of the human touch and abilities, and finding ways to showcase that is absolutely essential and crucial. So,
Hmm.
honestly, I think this advice applies to everybody, but I think even more so for international students because the culture in a lot of Asia, by Asia, India, China, and the rest of Southeast Asia, is heavily focused on test scores and your ability to just like work hard, get stuff done. And that's crucial. But again, you have to ask yourself, hey, if I can program or prompt an AI accordingly or use agents, it could do a lot of this. So where's your human edge? Where's the value that you really bring to the table? And showcasing that is essential.
Yeah, well, and I think that presents an interesting challenge because certainly, I mean, you can maybe have some experience with like leadership or EQ in your home country, but I think one of
Mm,
the biggest challenges of going abroad to go to school, regardless of where you're coming from and where you're going, is like,
yep,
speaking the language and dealing with the sort of the customs and norms of that new place.
true.
So, like, what, yeah, I mean, maybe this is almost like once you get into your MBA program, like what do you do? But yeah, it's
Yeah.
just I feel like that's a unique challenge. I mean, do you have any advice around that?
Yeah, it really is. And again, to the credit of most international, sorry, most MBA programs, they have, as I said, become very global in the way they teach and encourage you to think about organizational behavior, human psychology, and so on. So a lot of people do become well equipped to manage international teams, manage people from all over the world. You should be able to take your learnings and go back to your home country or go back to any other country and be able to apply these things effectively. Of course, for example, the US schools are going to be a bit more US focused in the way they teach these things. Other schools may be a bit more biased towards their regions or countries. But on the whole, people should be well equipped to handle very diverse teams. And this is why MBA programs want a lot of international students, because in a classroom environment, you should be able to interact and deal with people from all over the world and understand the cultural nuances of where they're from. So, of course, maybe there may be an initial culture shock, but as time goes by, through during your program and afterwards, you should be able to learn and adapt.
Yeah, that's great. And then just let's talk about really quickly just like the testing situation. I think that one of the things
Mm,
that we wanted to talk about was like, GRE versus GMAT for students abroad. Do you feel
sure.
like there's any kind of preference there or just advice around that?
Yeah, look, I think in terms of preference, what we see is that the majority of international students prefer to take the GRE. I think that the historic rationale for that has been that the language, so meaning the English that is used and also tested, tends to be easier than the GMAT. And for a lot of international students for whom maybe English is not their first language or they're not as comfortable, they prefer to take the GRE. But as a result of that, it means the competitiveness in the GRE is a lot higher, especially on the quant section. So the scores you need to achieve on the GRE tend to be you need to get, I'd say, above 90th percentile to be safe. Whereas with the GMAT, you could maybe get a score that's in the 80th percentile or 85th percentile and still stand a good chance at the top MBA schools. So in terms of preference, that's what we see. In terms of advice, that's what we'd say, right? If you're competent at English and I think more analytically minded, my recommendation always is to take the GMAT because the GMAT is designed for business school, whereas the GRE is designed more generally for master's programs and can be a bit more difficult. So yeah, that's the general approach we take. But whether that like the advice we give is one thing, but most people do prefer to take the GRE. That's what we've seen.
Interesting. Yeah. I wonder if it has to do with the fact that like the verbal section, which is typically the part that, non-native speakers have the most trouble with,
Yes.
the verbal section has the verbal section is in the GRE is a lot more like vocab focused
Yeah.
versus the verbal section in the GMAT is a little bit more like structure and grammar focused. So I wonder if that,
Exactly.
because like
It's
if you
exactly
are
right.
somebody that's like really, really into, how good you are at school, which it kind of feels like a lot of these people are, memorizing a vocab list of English words is probably a lot easier.
Yeah. You're spot on. And look, again, just speaking in my from my personal example, I grew up entirely being English educated, and so the GMAT English for me was a breeze. I think I barely spent any time studying for it, and I still got a very high score. Whereas, so if you're an English native speaker, it's honestly still very manageable. But as you rightly say, for the GRE, it is more vocab focused, and so that also tends to be more appealing to international students or people who are
Yeah.
non-native in English. Yeah.
Great. And then anything else that you wanted to make sure we talked about today before we wrap up?
I just generally to say, look, I think for international candidates all around the world, don't be despondent, don't lose hope. A top tier MBA for the right person at the right time is still life changing, and I think a lot of people know that. Just generally, what I'd encourage and what we at MBALink encourage is be open minded. That's the main change really from a few years ago, and be flexible. The ground is changing very fast, not just from a visa policy, but also in terms of the work and job market. The very nature of business is changing as well. So if you are on top of things and adaptable, you will flourish. In fact, an MBA will make you, it'll give you superpowers almost. I could put it that way. But if you're lazy and you just think, hey, the MBA, an MBA is like a magic wand that's going to make me amazing and get me a higher salary and better job, etc., it may not work as well. Just be open minded, be aware, and be adaptable.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Karthik Rajeswaran from MBALink. And Achievable has a great online GRE course. You can try it for free by going to achievable.me.